My name is Marcus, and I used to think that building an empire with someone meant they'd never try to tear it down. I was wrong. The moment my mother-in-law called me a gold digger at Thanksgiving dinner, I smiled and said, "Funny, because tomorrow I'm cutting off the gold." Then I handed my wife the divorce papers. The room went silent. It wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about showing them who actually built the kingdom they were trying to steal. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The rain hammered against the floor-to-ceiling windows of our penthouse as I sat in my leather chair staring at the documents spread across my mahogany desk. Each page represented another piece of the puzzle I'd been assembling for months. Bank statements, incorporation papers, patent filings, trade agreements, all bearing one signature more than any other mine. The irony wasn't lost on me that Victoria's family had spent 3 years calling me a parasite while I was the one who'd actually built the host they were all feeding off of. I reached for my coffee mug, the ceramic cold against my fingers. The liquid had gone bitter hours ago, but I drank it anyway. Bitter seemed appropriate for this moment. Through the rain-streaked glass, I could see the lights of Manhattan twinkling below us, each one representing dreams, ambitions, empires being built and torn down. 3 years ago, I'd looked out this same window and thought I was living the American dream. Tonight I was planning its funeral. My phone buzzed against the polished wood. Another text from Victoria. "Where are you? Mom's making her famous turkey. Family's asking about you." I deleted it without responding. Her mother's famous turkey. The same woman who'd stood in our kitchen 6 months ago and told me I'd never amount to anything more than a pretty face with a business degree from a state school. The same woman who'd whispered to Victoria at our wedding that she was marrying beneath her station. The same woman who'd never asked where the money came from to pay for that kitchen, that wedding, or the roof over her own head. Victoria Chen had walked into my life during my second year at Columbia Business School. I was working 3 part-time jobs to pay for tuition, living in a studio apartment in Queens that was smaller than most people's closets. She was elegant, refined, came from old money that traced back to her great-grandfather's textile empire in Hong Kong. Her family had connections that opened doors I didn't even know existed. When she smiled at me across the library that first day, I thought I'd won the lottery. What I didn't realize was that I'd already been building my own jackpot. The Chen family empire wasn't what it appeared to be. Oh, they had trappings. The estate in Westchester, the art collection, the charitable foundation galas where everyone wore designer gowns and wrote checks with too many zeros. But underneath the silk and crystal, the foundation was cracking, had been for years. Victoria's father, Richard Chen, was a master at managing perception, while the actual business hemorrhaged money. Import regulations had changed, manufacturing costs in China had skyrocketed, and their primary competitors had adapted while the Chens clung to methods that worked in 1985. I discovered this 3 months into dating Victoria. She'd brought me home for dinner, and Richard had taken me into his study afterward. The mahogany paneling was identical to what I'd eventually install in our penthouse, but his had water damage behind the expensive books. The Monet hanging above his desk was beautiful, but I'd done enough research to know it was one of 17 copies floating around the private auction circuit. He'd poured himself a scotch that probably cost more than my monthly rent, and asked me about my intentions with his daughter. "I'm studying international trade," I'd told him. Specifically, supply chain optimization for luxury goods imports. It wasn't entirely true. My focus was broader than that. But something in his eyes shifted when I mentioned supply chains. A flicker of interest, maybe desperation. He'd started asking me questions about Chinese manufacturing costs, about new trade routes through Vietnam and Malaysia. I'd answered honestly, sharing research I'd been doing for a paper on emerging markets. That conversation changed everything. Within 6 months I was spending weekends at the Chen estate, not as Victoria's boyfriend, but as Richard's unofficial consultant. He'd give me access to their books, their contracts, their shipping manifests. In return I'd provide analysis, suggestions, solutions to problems that had been bleeding them dry. Victoria thought I was just trying to impress her father. Her mother, Eleanor, thought I was angling for a payout. Neither of them realized I was saving their legacy. The first breakthrough came when I identified their primary shipping bottleneck. The Chens had been using the same freight company for 15 years, premium rates for routes that made no economic sense in the current market. I spent 2 weeks mapping out alternative logistics networks, reached out to contacts I'd made through my professors, and presented Richard with a plan that would cut their shipping costs by 40% while reducing delivery times. He implemented it immediately. The savings in the first quarter alone were enough to keep the business afloat for another year. That's when I realized what was really happening. The Chen family wasn't just wealthy, they were desperate. Every beautiful thing in their world was mortgaged, leveraged, or borrowed against. The estate had 3 liens. Eleanor's jewelry had been quietly replaced with high-quality replicas, while the originals sat in safety deposit boxes as collateral for loans. Even Victoria's trust fund existed mostly on paper, a shell game of transferred assets and deferred payments. But I could fix it. More than that, I could revolutionize it. My senior thesis became the blueprint for what would eventually become Chen Martinez International. I'd legally changed my last name when Victoria and I got engaged, hyphenating it to honor both our families. At the time I thought it was romantic. Now I see it was strategic, even if I didn't realize it then. The hyphenation made me a Chen by association, which opened doors in international business that would have remained locked to Marcus Martinez from Phoenix, Arizona. The business model was elegant in its simplicity. Instead of importing finished goods from established manufacturers, we'd identify emerging designers and craftspeople throughout Asia and South America, provide them with capital and technical support to scale their operations, then secure exclusive distribution rights for North American and European markets. We'd be their bridge to the global economy, while building our own network of suppliers who owed their success to our partnership. Richard loved the concept but lacked the vision to execute it properly. Eleanor called it too risky, and suggested I focus on learning the family business instead of trying to reinvent it. Victoria thought it sounded like too much work, and wondered why I couldn't just use my MBA to get a nice job at Goldman Sachs like her cousin Jeffrey, so I built it myself. The first partnership was with a leather goods artisan in Buenos Aires, whose family had been crafting handbags for 4 generations. They had exquisite technique, but no access to international markets. I used my own savings, about $8,000 from years of part-time jobs, to place an initial order for 50 bags. I brought them to a trade show in New York, selling 37 of them in 2 days to boutique retailers who were hungry for unique products their competitors couldn't access. The profit margin was substantial, but more importantly, I'd proven the model worked. Within 6 months I had partnerships with craftspeople in Peru, Thailand and Morocco. Within a year I was managing exclusive relationships with over 40 suppliers across 12 countries. The Chen family business was still hemorrhaging money from their traditional operations, but the new division I'd created was generating enough profit to keep them afloat. Victoria and I married the summer after I graduated. The ceremony was held at the family estate, with 300 guests who drank champagne paid for by profits from my partnerships. Eleanor wore a new Chanel dress purchased with money I generated. Richard gave a toast about how proud he was to welcome me into the family business, conveniently forgetting that I'd built the only part of it that was actually profitable. That should have been my first warning. The second warning came during our honeymoon in Tuscany. Victoria and I were staying in a villa that cost more per night than most people's monthly salary. I was reviewing contracts on my laptop, finalizing a partnership with a ceramics cooperative outside Florence, when she asked me why I was working on our honeymoon. "This isn't work," I told her. "This is our future." She'd laughed, that tinkling sound that had charmed me in the Columbia Library. "Marcus darling, our future is already secured. Daddy has plans for you in the traditional business once we get back. Real business, not these little craft projects." Little craft projects, that's what she called the enterprises that were paying for our villa, our flights, her new wardrobe, and the diamond bracelet she'd bought in Rome the day before. I should have corrected her then, should have explained that her father's traditional business was a sinking ship, and my little craft projects were the lifeboats keeping everyone afloat. Instead I kissed her forehead and went back to my laptop. I told myself she just didn't understand business, that she'd see the bigger picture eventually. But some people never want to see the bigger picture when the smaller one makes them feel more comfortable. Our first year of marriage was a blur of expansion and success. I opened offices in Miami and Los Angeles to better serve our growing network of retail partners. I hired a team of talented young professionals who understood that we weren't just importing products, we were building relationships. I developed quality control standards that ensured every item bearing our label met expectations that would justify premium pricing. I created marketing strategies that told the stories of our partner artisans, connecting American consumers to the human faces behind the luxury goods they purchased. Revenue grew by 300%. Profit margins held steady at levels that would make most established importers weep with envy. We secured partnerships with major department stores, high-end boutiques, and even launched an exclusive line for a celebrity fashion designer whose publicist had reached out after seeing our work at a trade show. Richard took credit for the growth during board meetings. Eleanor started referring to it as the family business when speaking to her friends at the country club. Victoria began telling people that her husband was doing so well in Daddy's company, but the paperwork told a different story. Every business license was filed under my name. Every partnership agreement bore my signature as the primary contact. Every bank account was opened with my social security number as the primary account holder. When I'd started building the business, I'd done it this way for practical reasons. I was the one doing the work, traveling to meet partners, negotiating contracts, managing operations. It made sense for me to be the legal entity behind the business. It also made sense from a liability perspective, something I'd learned in business school. If the traditional Chen family business continued to fail, I wanted to ensure that my operations remained protected. So I'd structured Chen Martinez International as a separate entity from Chen Textiles, with licensing agreements that allowed me to use their existing distribution networks while maintaining legal independence. At the time, I thought I was being responsible. Now I realize I was being prophetic. The first real conflict came during our second Thanksgiving as a married couple. I'd just returned from a trip to Thailand, where I'd secured exclusive rights to a collection of hand-woven silk scarves that would become one of our best-selling items the following spring. The profit projections were staggering, and I was excited to share the news with Victoria's family. Eleanor was carving the turkey when I mentioned the Thai partnership. She looked up from the bird, knife poised in the air, and asked how much I'd spent on the initial order. $47,000, I'd said, but the projected returns over the first year are nearly $300,000, and that's conservative. The quality is extraordinary, and the Artisan Collective has agreed to exclusivity in exchange for guaranteed minimum orders. The silence that followed was deafening. Richard cleared his throat and asked where the $47,000 had come from. The business account, I'd replied, the same account that generated the profits to cover the estate's mortgage payment last month. That's when Eleanor's facade cracked. She set down the carving knife and looked at me with an expression I'd never seen before. Cold, calculating, dismissive. "Marcus," she said, "I think you've forgotten your place in this family." Victoria reached for my hand under the table, but her grip felt weak.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
Uncertain. Explain what you mean by that, I'd said calmly. Eleanor smiled, but there was nothing warm about it. You married into this family, dear. That means you married into our business, our decisions, our approval process. You can't just spend family money on whatever little hobby catches your fancy. Family money. The money I'd generated. The profits I'd created. The revenues that were keeping their estate out of foreclosure. I'm not spending family money, I'd said. I'm investing business profits into business growth. The same way any successful enterprise operates. Richard intervened before Eleanor could respond, suggesting we talk about something more pleasant. But the damage was done. The lines had been drawn. In their minds, I was an employee who'd gotten too comfortable with the checkbook. In my mind, I was the founder and operator of a business they happened to benefit from. We didn't resolve that conflict that Thanksgiving. We just buried it under polite conversation and moved on. But it festered. Over the following months, Eleanor started making comments about my spending habits, my business trips, my partnerships. She'd question every decision, every expenditure, every strategy, always couched in concern for the family business, but delivered with the clear implication that I was overstepping my boundaries. Victoria started siding with her mother more often than not. She'd suggest I run major decisions by Richard before implementing them. She'd question why I needed to travel so much when I could just handle partnerships over the phone. She'd hint that maybe it was time for me to focus on the traditional business and let someone else manage the international operations. Someone like her cousin Jeffrey, perhaps. The Goldman Sachs analyst who'd never built anything in his life but understood how to manage existing assets. The breaking point came last spring. I'd been developing a partnership with a sustainable fashion cooperative in Guatemala that would have positioned us perfectly for the growing eco-conscious luxury market. The initial investment was substantial, nearly $200,000, but the potential returns were enormous. More importantly, it aligned with consumer trends that would define the next decade of luxury retail. I presented the opportunity to Richard during our quarterly business review. He was intrigued but wanted time to consider it. That evening at dinner I mentioned the Guatemala project to Victoria. She listened politely, asked a few questions about timeline and projected returns, then said she thought it sounded promising. 2 days later, Eleanor called me into Richard's study. She was sitting in his chair reading through the Guatemala proposal with a red pen in her hand. She'd crossed out entire sections, made margin notes questioning my research, and circled the investment amount multiple times. "This is unacceptable," she'd said without preamble. "Which part?" I'd asked. "All of it. The risk, the expense, the presumption." She leaned back in Richard's chair like she owned it. "Marcus, I've been patient with your little experiments because they've generated some revenue. But this is beyond reasonable. The Guatemala project represents the future of sustainable luxury goods," I'd said. "Every major retailer is shifting toward eco-conscious products. If we don't establish partnerships now, we'll be buying from middlemen in 5 years." Eleanor had laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "If we don't establish partnerships?" "Marcus, darling, there is no wit in this decision. You work for this family. You don't make policy for this family." That's when I realized how she'd always seen me. Not as Victoria's husband. Not as Richard's business partner. Not even as an employee with valuable expertise. I was hired help who'd gotten too comfortable with the family. "I see," I'd said. "Then perhaps it's time we clarified exactly who works for whom." Eleanor's smile had been triumphant. "Perhaps it is." That night, I'd started my research. Real research, the kind that involved lawyers and forensic accountants and private investigators who specialize in corporate structure analysis. What I discovered over the following weeks would have been funny if it hadn't been so infuriating. Chen Martinez International wasn't just legally separate from the traditional Chen family business, it was financially independent, operationally independent, and had been carrying the older company for nearly 3 years. The Chen textiles that Eleanor and Richard were so proud of had been operating at a loss since before I'd married Victoria. Their overhead was crushing them. Their client base was shrinking, and their debt was mounting. Every dollar they'd spent on maintaining their lifestyle, every payment toward the estate's mortgages, every designer dress Eleanor wore to charity galas, had come from profits generated by my partnerships. I wasn't working for the Chen family business. The Chen family business was surviving off my work. The legal structure I'd created to protect my operations had inadvertently protected me from their failures. While Chen Textiles accumulated debt and legal liabilities, Chen Martinez International had built assets, secured profitable partnerships, and established a reputation for reliability in international markets. I owned the relationships with suppliers. I controlled the distribution agreements. I held the trademarks and patents for several innovative products we'd developed. In short, I'd built an empire while they'd maintained the illusion of one. That's when I started planning my exit strategy. The private investigator I'd hired discovered that Eleanor had been making inquiries about transferring my partnership agreements to Jeffrey. She'd contacted several of our suppliers directly, introducing herself as the new point of contact for North American operations. She'd even met with our banker to discuss consolidating the Chen Martinez accounts under the broader Chen family financial umbrella. She was trying to steal my business while calling me the gold digger. The irony was perfect. Eleanor Chen, who'd never worked a day in her life, who'd married into wealth and spent 40 years managing its decline, was attempting to seize control of a profitable enterprise built by the man she considered beneath her station. She wanted to hand my life's work to her nephew, a kid whose biggest business decision was choosing between a BMW and a Mercedes for his graduation gift. That's when I started documenting everything. Every conversation, every meeting, every decision that had built Chen Martinez International from a graduate school thesis into a multi-million-dollar operation. I compiled evidence showing that the business was legally and operationally separate from Chen Textiles. I gathered financial records proving that my operations had subsidized their lifestyle for years. I collected correspondence, demonstrating their plans to push me out of the company I'd created. I also started making contingency plans. I reached out to our key suppliers, reinforcing my role as their primary contact and partner. I secured independent financing that would allow Chen Martinez International to operate without any connection to Chen family resources. I consulted with lawyers about protecting my intellectual property and partnership agreements in the event of a hostile takeover attempt. Most importantly, I started preparing Victoria for a conversation that would either save our marriage or end it. She'd been growing more distant over the past few months, more aligned with her family's perspective than with mine. She'd started questioning my business decisions, suggesting that maybe it was time for me to step back and let others take more responsibility. She'd hinted that her cousin Jeffrey had some interesting ideas about expanding our operations through more traditional channels. Traditional channels, code for letting the Chen family absorb my business into their failing enterprise. The conversation finally happened 3 weeks ago, on a Sunday morning in our penthouse kitchen. Victoria was reading the Times while I made coffee, a domestic scene that felt increasingly fragile with each passing day. I decided to be direct, to lay out the facts and let her choose which side of the divide she wanted to stand on. Victoria, I'd said, we need to talk about the business. She'd looked up from the newspaper, coffee cup paused halfway to her lips. What about it? Your family wants to take it away from me. Her response told me everything I needed to know. No surprise, no indignation, no immediate denial, just a careful, measured question. What makes you think that? Because your mother has been contacting our suppliers behind my back. Because Jeffrey has been asking questions about our partnership agreements. Because your father suggested last week that maybe it's time for me to focus on strategy while other people handle operations. Victoria had set down her coffee cup carefully, precisely, like she was buying time to choose her words. Marcus, she'd said finally, maybe that's not such a bad idea. You've been working so hard, traveling constantly, missing family events. Maybe it would be good for you to step back a little. Step back from the business I'd built, from the partnerships I'd cultivated, from the empire that was subsidizing her family's empire of illusions, and let Jeffrey step forward, I'd asked. Her silence was answer enough. That afternoon, I'd called my lawyer and started divorce proceedings. Not because I wanted to hurt Victoria, but because I'd finally understood that she'd never seen me as her partner. I was a resource to be managed, an asset to be leveraged, an employee who'd gotten too big for his position. The divorce papers were filed 3 days later. The business reorganization documents were filed the same day, officially transferring all Chen Martinez International operations to a new corporate structure with no connection to the Chen family name or finances. I'd kept the international partnerships, the supplier relationships, the trademarks, and the client contracts. They could keep the Chen name and the debts that went with it. Victoria had been served the papers at her yoga class. According to my lawyer, she'd read them calmly, signed for receipt, then driven straight to the family estate. The emergency family meeting that followed lasted 6 hours and apparently involved several heated phone calls to lawyers who delivered increasingly bad news about their legal options. By the time Victoria returned to our penthouse that evening, I'd already moved into a hotel suite downtown. She'd found me packing my remaining personal items, mostly books and the few photographs that meant something to me. She'd stood in the doorway of our bedroom, watching me fold shirts into a suitcase, and asked the question I'd been expecting. Is there someone else? No, I'd said honestly. There's just me, finally choosing myself over your family's comfort. She'd tried to negotiate then, suggesting counseling, mediation, a trial separation instead of divorce. She'd promised that her mother would apologize, that Jeffrey would step back, that I could maintain control of the international operations while working more closely with the traditional business. But her promises were just words, and I'd learned to pay attention to actions instead. The action of her mother trying to steal my partnerships, the action of her father suggesting I step aside, the action of her cousin positioning himself as my replacement. The action of Victoria herself questioning my authority over the business I'd built from nothing. It's too late for promises, I'd told her. It was too late the moment your family decided I was the hired help instead of the person keeping them solvent. The final insult came last week, 5 days before Thanksgiving. Eleanor had called my hotel room directly, somehow getting the number from someone at the front desk. Her voice had been sickeningly sweet, the tone she reserved for service workers and people she considered beneath her notice. Marcus, darling, she'd said, I think we've all gotten a bit emotional about this business situation. Why don't you come to Thanksgiving dinner and we can discuss this like family? We're not family anymore, I'd said. Don't be dramatic. Victoria loves you. We all care about you. But you have to understand that your behavior has been very concerning. This divorce nonsense, moving out, trying to steal the business, it's not like you. Steal the business I'd created, built and operated while they collected the profits. Eleanor, I'd said, I'm curious about something. When you called me a gold digger at Thanksgiving 3 years ago, what exactly did you think I was digging for? The line had gone quiet for a moment, then she'd laughed, that crystalline sound that had always preceded her cruelest observations. Oh Marcus, you always were too sensitive. I never called you a gold digger, but I had recordings. The private investigator I'd hired had been thorough, and one of his recommendations was to document all interactions with the Chen family. I'd been recording our conversations for months, building a comprehensive record of their attempts to undermine my authority and seize control of my business. I'd played her the clip, her own voice, from Thanksgiving dinner 2 years ago, crystal clear through the phone speaker. Victoria's husband is charming, but let's be honest about what he's really after. Some people marry for love, and some people marry for gold. I think we all know which category Marcus falls into. The silence that followed was the longest I'd ever experienced with Eleanor Chen. I see you've been recording private family conversations, she'd said finally. How very professional of you. I learned to document everything from the best, I'd replied. Your husband taught me that good business requires good records. She'd hung up without another word. That brings us to tonight. Tomorrow is Thanksgiving, and I won't be carving turkey at the Chen family table. Instead, I'll be signing the final paperwork that makes my independence official and irreversible. The divorce will be finalized by Christmas. The business reorganization will be complete by New Year's. And the Chen family will learn what their empire actually looks like without my subsidies holding it together. I picked up the photographs I'd laid out on my desk. Pictures from our engagement party, our wedding, various family gatherings over the past 3 years. In every single one I looked happy. Genuinely, completely happy. I'd thought I was building something beautiful with someone I loved. I'd thought I was becoming part of a family that would value my contributions and respect my capabilities. Instead, I'd been building a foundation for people who wanted to bury me beneath it. The rain against the windows was slowing now, individual drops instead of the steady downpour that had been falling all evening. I gathered the photographs into a neat stack and placed them in the box with other mementos from my marriage, not because I wanted to throw them away, but because I wanted to remember the person I'd been before I learned to see clearly. Tomorrow, when Eleanor carves her famous turkey, she'll be doing it with knives purchased with profits from partnerships that no longer exist. When Richard raises his glass to toast family, he'll be drinking wine paid for with revenues that have been redirected. When Jeffrey talks about his plans for expanding the business, he'll be describing strategies for managing assets that are no longer there. And when Victoria asks where I am, they'll finally have to acknowledge the truth. I was never the gold digger in this family. I was the gold mine they tried to strip and abandon. The irony is that I still love Victoria, not the woman who questioned my authority and sided with her family against me, but the woman I met in that Columbia library who seemed to see something special in a kid from Phoenix working 3 jobs to pay for business school. The woman who encouraged my ambitions and celebrated my successes, at least until they started threatening her family's sense of control. But love isn't enough when the person you love sees you as an asset instead of an equal. And family isn't family when they treat you like an employee they can dismiss at will. I closed the box of photographs and placed it on the shelf next to my law and business school textbooks. Tomorrow would bring lawyers and documents and the final steps of cutting ties that should have been cut years ago. But tonight, I just sat in my hotel suite, looking out at the city lights, planning the next chapter of an empire that would finally truly belong to me alone. The morning sun was filtering through the hotel suite windows when my phone started buzzing at precisely 6:45. Victoria's ringtone, the Vivaldi piece she'd programmed years ago, when we were still pretending our marriage was a classical romance rather than a corporate merger. I let it ring through to voicemail, then it rang again, and again. By the 7th call I finally picked up. Marcus, thank God. Her voice was strained, lacking the composed elegance she usually wore like expensive perfume. We need to talk. Something's happened. I was standing at the bathroom mirror, electric razor in hand, preparing for what I expected to be the most important day of my professional life. The final signatures, the last documents. The moment when Chen Martinez International would officially cease to have any connection to the Chen family name or fortune. What's happened, Victoria? The bank called. They're freezing our accounts pending some kind of investigation. Daddy's lawyer says there might be irregularities in how the business funds were handled. They're asking about transfers, about authorization, about... She paused, and I could hear her breathing change. About you. I set down the razor and walked to the window overlooking Madison Avenue. Even at this early hour, the city was pulsing with energy. People rushing to build empires, destroy them, steal them, protect. The eternal dance of ambition and survival that made New York the center of everything that mattered. Which accounts? I asked, though I already knew the answer. All of them. The estate account, the business operating account, even my personal checking account is locked down. Her voice was getting higher, more panicked. Marcus, they're saying there might be fraud charges, embezzlement. They mentioned your name specifically. I allowed myself a small smile that she couldn't see through the phone. Interesting timing. What do you mean, interesting timing? This is serious. This is our family's reputation, our livelihood, your family's reputation, I corrected. Not mine, not anymore. The silence that followed was heavy enough to feel through the phone line. When she spoke again, her voice had dropped to barely above a whisper. You did this. I protected what was mine, I replied. There's a difference. What Victoria didn't know, what none of the Chen family knew, was that I'd been anticipating this exact scenario for months. When I'd first started documenting their attempts to steal my business, my lawyer had suggested we also examine the financial arrangements that had been keeping their traditional operations afloat. What we discovered was a fascinating example of how good intentions can create legal vulnerabilities. For 3 years I'd been using profits from Chen Martinez International to cover expenses related to Chen Textiles, the estate mortgage payments, Eleanor's shopping expenses, Richard's country club dues, even Victoria's personal spending had all been subsidized by revenues from my partnerships. I'd done it willingly, even gladly, because I'd thought we were building something together as a family. But the legal structure of those transfers was more complicated than I'd realized. Since Chen Martinez International was technically a separate entity from Chen Textiles, every dollar that crossed between the two companies should have been documented as either a loan, an investment, or a management fee. Instead, they'd been treated as informal family transfers with no paperwork, no interest rates, no repayment schedules, and no approval process beyond my own discretion. In other words, from a banking perspective, it looked exactly like embezzlement. The irony was exquisite. The Chen family, who'd spent months accusing me of stealing their business, had unknowingly been accepting stolen money for years, money that I'd stolen from my own company to subsidize their lifestyle, money that they'd never questioned, never documented, never declared on their tax returns as income. My forensic accountant had calculated the total at just over $2.3 million. $2.3 million in undocumented transfers from a profitable business to a failing one, authorized by a person who had no legal standing to make such transfers on behalf of the profitable business's other stakeholders. Of course, there were no other stakeholders. I owned Chen Martinez International outright, but the bank didn't know that, at least not yet. All they knew was that someone named Marcus Martinez had been moving substantial sums of money between accounts belonging to different business entities without proper documentation or authorization. The investigation will take about 6 weeks, I told Victoria calmly. During that time, all Chen family accounts will remain frozen while they trace the source and destination of every transfer. They'll want to interview Richard about his knowledge of the transfers. They'll want to interview Eleanor about her use of funds that originated from accounts she had no legal access to. They'll want to interview you about personal expenses paid for with business revenues. You bastard. The words came out flat, emotionless. You planned this. I planned to protect myself, I said. The investigation is just a side effect of your family's creative approach to financial management. What I didn't tell her was that I'd also provided the bank with a complete set of documentation showing my ownership of Chen Martinez International and my authorization for every transfer. The investigation would ultimately clear me of any wrongdoing, but it would take weeks for the bank to sort through the deliberately complex paper trail I'd created. Weeks during which the Chen family would have no access to the accounts they'd been living off of for years. Weeks during which they'd finally understand what their lives looked like without my subsidies. Victoria was crying now, Soft sounds that once would have broken my heart. Now they just sounded like the tears of someone who'd finally run out of other people's money to spend. How could you do this to us? To me, I'm your wife.
You were my wife, I corrected. Now you're the ex-wife of someone your family tried to rob. I ended the call and finished shaving in silence. The face looking back at me from the mirror was the same one Victoria had fallen in love with in that Columbia library, but the eyes were different, harder, more focused. The eyes of someone who'd learned that trust was a luxury he couldn't afford and family was a privilege that had to be earned. An hour later, I was sitting in my lawyer's conference room, surrounded by documents that would officially end one chapter of my life and begin another. Sarah Goldman was probably the best corporate attorney in Manhattan, which was saying something in a city where legal talent was measured in billions rather than millions. She'd handled divorces for hedge fund managers, business dissolutions for tech billionaires, and hostile takeovers for companies whose names appeared on the Fortune 500 list. She was also, coincidentally, Victoria's law school roommate, which made this morning's meeting particularly satisfying. The divorce papers are straightforward, Sarah said, sliding a thick folder across the mahogany conference table. No children, no jointly owned property, and a prenuptial agreement that clearly delineates separate assets. Victoria gets to keep her trust fund, assuming it still exists after the banking investigation concludes. You keep the business you built before and during the marriage, and the business reorganization, complete as of this morning. Chen Martinez International no longer exists. Martinez Global Enterprises is now the sole entity controlling all your international partnerships, supplier relationships, and client contracts. The Chen family has no legal claim to any aspect of your operations. I signed each document carefully, taking my time to read every clause and provision. These weren't just legal papers, they were the blueprints for a new life built on foundations that couldn't be shaken by someone else's ambitions or assumptions. There's something else, Sarah said as I finished with the last signature. I got a call this morning from someone representing the Chen family. They're requesting a meeting to discuss what they called a mutually beneficial resolution to the current misunderstanding. Mutually beneficial, I repeated. That's interesting phrasing. It gets more interesting. They're offering to drop any claims regarding the business if you'll agree to provide emergency funding to cover their expenses during the banking investigation. I laughed, actually laughed for the first time in weeks. They want me to give them money to compensate them for trying to steal money from me. That's about the size of it, yes. What did you tell them? Sarah's smile was sharp enough to cut glass. I told them that Mr. Martinez would be happy to discuss emergency funding arrangements at his standard consulting rate of $500 per hour with a minimum engagement of 40 hours payable in advance. And they hung up. I gathered the signed documents into a neat stack and placed them in my briefcase. The weight felt different somehow, lighter and heavier at the same time. Lighter because I was finally free from obligations and expectations that had been crushing me for years. Heavier because I was now carrying the full responsibility for everything I'd built and everything I still wanted to build. Sarah, I said, I need you to do something else for me. What's that? I want you to prepare an offer to purchase Chen Textiles when it inevitably goes into bankruptcy. Not for the business, which is worthless, but for their client list and distribution contracts. I have some ideas about how to restructure their operations to actually turn a profit. Sarah leaned back in her chair, studying my face with the kind of professional interest that had made her legendary in corporate legal circles. You want to buy your ex-wife's family business. I want to buy the assets that have value and let the rest die a natural death. There's a difference. It's going to look vindictive. It's going to be profitable. Everything else is just perspective. I left Sarah's office with a sense of completion that had been missing from my life for months. The divorce was final. The business was secured. The bank investigation would clear my name while destroying theirs, and in 6 months when Chen Textiles finally collapsed under the weight of its own incompetence, I'd be there to purchase the pieces that might still be worth salvaging. But first I had some other business to attend to. The taxi dropped me off in front of a glass tower in the financial district, home to Meridian Capital Management. Meridian handled investment portfolios for what they politely called ultra-high net worth individuals, which was Wall Street's way of saying people who had more money than some small countries. I'd been recommended to them by one of my graduate school professors who'd gone on to manage sovereign wealth funds for Middle Eastern oil dynasties. The receptionist, a woman in her 30s with the kind of perfect posture that came from expensive yoga classes, greeted me with a smile that managed to be both professional and genuinely warm. Mr. Martinez, Mr. Harrison is waiting for you in conference room C.
David Harrison was exactly what I'd expected from a Meridian partner, tall, silver-haired, wearing a suit that probably cost more than most people's cars, with the kind of confident handshake that suggested he'd closed deals worth more money than most people could conceptualize. His office overlooked the harbor, with a view of the Statue of Liberty that seemed almost symbolic. "I've reviewed your financial statements," he said without preamble, gesturing for me to take a seat in one of the leather chairs facing his desk. "Impressive growth trajectory. Very impressive. Your business shows the kind of consistent profitability that we like to see in our clients." "Thank you. The question, of course, is what you want to do with that profitability. Your current assets are heavily concentrated in a single business entity. That's created substantial wealth, but it's also created substantial risk. If something happens to Martinez Global Enterprises, you lose everything." I'd been thinking about this exact issue for weeks. Building Chen Martinez International had required me to invest everything I had, financially and emotionally, into a single venture. It had worked brilliantly, but it had also left me vulnerable to exactly the kind of family politics that had nearly destroyed everything I'd built. "I want to diversify," I said. "I want to maintain control of the core business, but I also want investments that can generate income independently of my direct involvement." Harrison nodded approvingly. "Smart thinking. We typically recommend a portfolio structure that balances growth potential with stability. Some blue-chip equities, some international bonds, maybe some real estate investment trusts, possibly some exposure to emerging markets." I was thinking more aggressively than that. "How much more aggressively?" I leaned forward in the leather chair, meeting his gaze directly. "I want to buy companies, small to medium-sized businesses with solid fundamentals but poor management, companies I can restructure, optimize, and either operate profitably or sell at substantial gains." Harrison's eyebrows rose slightly. "You're talking about private equity investments. That's a different game entirely from portfolio management. I'm talking about building an empire instead of just managing wealth." The silence that followed was the kind that happens when someone realizes they're having a different conversation than they'd expected. Harrison steepled his fingers and studied me with the kind of intensity that suggested he was recalculating everything he'd assumed about my goals and capabilities. "Private equity requires substantial capital commitments," he said finally. "We're not talking about buying a few thousand shares of Microsoft. We're talking about acquiring controlling interests in operating businesses. The minimum investment for the kind of opportunities you're describing would be $10 to $15 million. I understand that. Do you have that kind of capital?" I reached into my briefcase and pulled out a folder containing financial statements that Sarah's office had prepared that morning. The numbers included not just the current value of Martinez Global Enterprises, but also the projected revenues from existing partnership agreements, and the estimated value of the intellectual property I'd developed over the past 3 years. Harrison opened the folder and began reading. I watched his expression change as he processed the figures, his professional composure giving way to something that looked like genuine surprise. "These numbers are verified?" he asked. "Every dollar, and these revenue projections, conservative. I expect to exceed them by at least 20%. Harrison closed the folder and leaned back in his chair. When he spoke again, his tone had shifted from polite professionalism to the kind of focused attention that money managers reserve for clients who could change their quarterly bonuses. "Mr. Martinez, I think we need to discuss a much more comprehensive wealth management strategy." We spent the next 2 hours mapping out what Harrison called an aggressive growth portfolio, and what I thought of as the foundation for something much bigger than a portfolio. The plan involved using the steady cash flow from Martinez Global Enterprises to fund acquisitions of underperforming businesses in related industries, import companies with outdated logistics networks, retail operations with poor inventory management, manufacturing partnerships that had never learned to optimize their supply chains. Each acquisition would be evaluated not just for its current profitability, but for its potential after I applied the same optimization strategies that had built my core business. Companies that were failing because of poor management could be turned around with the right expertise. Companies that were struggling because of limited market access could be revitalized through my international network of suppliers and distributors. The key, Harrison explained, is to identify businesses where the problem is execution rather than concept. A good business model run by incompetent management is an opportunity. A bad business model run by brilliant management is just an expensive lesson. By the time I left Meridian Capital Management, I had a clear strategy for the next phase of my career. The divorce had freed me from family obligations that had been limiting my growth. The business reorganization had protected my core assets from future interference. Now the wealth management strategy would allow me to expand beyond the limitations of a single company and begin building what I'd really wanted all along, an empire that couldn't be threatened by someone else's ambitions. The afternoon was spent in meetings with other professionals who would be essential to executing the new strategy. A private investigator who specialized in corporate due diligence to help me identify acquisition targets and evaluate their hidden liabilities, a team of management consultants who could handle the operational restructuring of acquirees while I focused on strategic decisions, an intellectual property lawyer who could help me protect the innovations and processes that gave my businesses competitive advantages. Each meeting reinforced the same fundamental truth: building wealth required more than just generating profits. It required creating systems that could generate profits independently of my direct involvement. It required building teams of competent professionals who could execute strategies without constant supervision. Most importantly, it required learning from the mistakes I'd made with the Chen family and ensuring that future partnerships were based on legal contracts rather than family loyalty. By 6 o'clock, I was back in my hotel suite, surrounded by business cards, legal documents, and strategic plans that represented the next chapter of my professional life. The view from my window showed Manhattan transitioning from the harsh light of day to the warm glow of evening, millions of lights beginning to twinkle in office buildings and apartments where other people were pursuing their own versions of the American dream. My phone buzzed with a text message from Victoria. "Please call me. We need to talk about Mom." I deleted the message without responding. Whatever was happening with Eleanor was no longer my problem to solve. The Chen family had made their choice when they decided I was an employee rather than a partner. Now they could live with the consequences of that choice without expecting me to provide solutions. Instead, I called room service and ordered something I could eat while reviewing the acquisition proposals that Harrison's team had prepared. 3 companies in different industries, all showing the same pattern: solid business models undermined by poor execution, reasonable assets encumbered by unreasonable debt, and management teams that had never learned to adapt to changing market conditions. The first company was a luxury goods importer based in Los Angeles, specializing in high-end home furnishings from European manufacturers. Their client list included several prestigious interior design firms and upscale retail chains, but their profit margins were being destroyed by inefficient logistics and overstaffed administrative operations. The owners, a married couple in their 60s, were looking to retire and willing to sell at a substantial discount to avoid bankruptcy. The second company was a specialty foods distributor in Miami, handling imports of artisanal products from South America and the Caribbean. They had exclusive relationships with several unique suppliers, but they'd never developed the marketing expertise to build brand recognition or the operational efficiency to compete with larger distributors. They were profitable but barely, and their growth had stagnated for 3 years running. The third company was the most interesting, a fashion accessories manufacturer in North Carolina that had developed innovative production techniques but lacked the international connections to expand beyond domestic markets. They held patents on several manufacturing processes that could be applied to other industries, and their existing client relationships suggested substantial growth potential if they could access better supply chains and distribution networks. All 3 companies shared the same fundamental characteristic: they needed exactly the kind of expertise I'd developed building Martinez Global Enterprises. They needed someone who understood international partnerships, supply chain optimization, and the operational strategies required to scale a business efficiently. They needed me, in other words, and I needed them because acquiring and restructuring these companies would demonstrate that my success with Chen Martinez International wasn't a fluke. It would prove that I could build value consistently, across different industries and market conditions. As I reviewed the financial statements and operational analyses, I felt the same excitement I'd experienced years ago when I'd first conceived the business model that had become my core company. The thrill of seeing potential that others had missed, of understanding how disconnected pieces could be assembled into something more valuable than the sum of their parts. This was what I'd been meant to do all along. Not just build a single successful business, but create a network of businesses that could support and strengthen each other. not just generate wealth but build the kind of diversified empire that could survive economic downturns, industry disruptions and family betrayals. My phone rang again, Victoria's ringtone cutting through the quiet of the hotel suite. This time I answered, curious about what new crisis had emerged from the banking investigation. "Marcus, please don't hang up," she said before I could speak. "Mom's in the hospital." I set down the acquisition proposal I'd been reading and walked to the window. The city lights were fully illuminated now, creating a constellation of ambition and achievement that stretched to every horizon. "What happened?" "She collapsed at home this morning. The stress, the bank investigation, everything that's been happening. The doctors say it was a panic attack, but she's not responding well to treatment. She keeps asking for you." "Asking for me to do what?" Victoria's voice broke slightly. "She wants to apologize. She wants to make things right. Marcus, she's 73 years old and she's terrified that she's going to lose everything her family built." "Her family didn't build anything," I said calmly. "Her family inherited something and then spent 40 years destroying it. The only thing preventing complete collapse was money I provided, money she accepted while calling me a gold digger." "She was wrong. We were all wrong. But that doesn't mean we deserve to lose everything." I watched a helicopter trace a path across the harbor, its lights blinking in a pattern that seemed almost like a code. Probably a medical helicopter, carrying someone from one crisis to another, trying to save something that might already be beyond saving. "Victoria, what exactly do you want from me? Help us. Not for free, not as family, but as a business arrangement. You know our operations better than anyone. You know what can be saved and what needs to be changed. We'll pay you consulting fees, give you equity in the restructured company, whatever it takes. You want to hire me to save the business your family tried to steal from me." "Yes." The honesty in her answer was surprising. No manipulation, no emotional appeals, no references to our marriage or family obligations, just a straightforward business proposition from someone who'd finally run out of other options. "I'll consider it," I said, "but not as a favor, and not out of sentiment. If I decide to help, it will be because I see a profitable opportunity, nothing more." "I understand. And Victoria, if I do decide to get involved, it won't be to preserve your family's legacy or maintain their lifestyle. It will be to extract value from assets that they've mismanaged. There's a difference." "I understand that too." After I hung up, I sat in the darkness of the hotel suite for a long time, thinking about the conversation and what it represented. 6 months ago, the Chen family had seen me as hired help who'd gotten too comfortable with the checkbook. Tonight they were asking me to save them from the consequences of their own incompetence. The irony was perfect, but more importantly, the opportunity was real. Chen Textiles, despite decades of poor management, still had valuable assets, client relationships, import licenses, distribution agreements, even some intellectual property that could be leveraged more effectively. The company was failing not because the underlying business model was flawed, but because the people running it had never learned to adapt to changing market conditions. In other words, it was exactly the kind of acquisition opportunity I'd been discussing with Harrison earlier that day. A good business model undermined by incompetent management. A company that could be profitable with the right expertise and operational strategies. The only difference was that this particular opportunity came with emotional baggage that the other acquisitions didn't carry. Buying Chen Textiles would mean working with people who'd betrayed my trust, disrespected my contributions, and tried to steal my life's work. It would mean spending time with Victoria while our divorce was still being finalized, dealing with Eleanor's judgment and Richard's passive-aggressive management style. But it would also mean acquiring valuable assets at a substantial discount, since no other buyer would be willing to take on the company's debts and liabilities. It would mean adding an established distribution network to my existing operations, creating synergies that could benefit all of my businesses. Most importantly, it would mean demonstrating that I could turn around even the most dysfunctional organizations. I opened my laptop and started researching Chen Textiles' current financial position, using databases and analysis tools that hadn't been available to me when I'd first started working with Richard years ago. What I found was worse than I'd expected, but also more promising. The company was hemorrhaging money at an accelerating rate, but the bleeding was concentrated in specific areas that could be addressed through operational changes. Their overhead was crushing them, but most of the excess costs came from maintaining a lifestyle rather than supporting business operations. Their debt was substantial, but it was secured by assets that had appreciated significantly over the years. In short, Chen Textiles was a company that could be saved, but only by someone willing to make dramatic changes that the current management would never accept. Changes like selling the estate and moving operations to more efficient facilities. Changes like eliminating redundant positions and restructuring the compensation system. Changes like focusing on profitable product lines while discontinuing the prestige projects that generated more ego satisfaction than revenue. Changes that would destroy the Chen family's sense of status while creating actual value for stakeholders. By midnight, I'd developed a preliminary restructuring plan that would return Chen Textiles to profitability within 18 months, while providing substantial returns on the acquisition investment. The plan would require eliminating about 60% of current expenses, renegotiating all major supplier agreements, and implementing the same operational strategies that had made Martinez Global Enterprises successful. It would also require the Chen family to accept that their days of treating the business as a personal ATM were permanently over. I saved the analysis to my laptop and closed the computer. Tomorrow, I'd discuss the opportunity with Harrison and my other advisors, getting their professional opinions on whether acquiring Chen Textiles made sense as an investment regardless of the personal complications involved. But tonight, I just wanted to savor the realization that had been building throughout the day. 6 months ago, I'd been the Chen family's son-in-law, working to build their legacy while they plotted to steal mine. Now I was in a position to acquire their legacy as a business asset while building my own empire on a scale they'd never imagined. The gold digger had become the gold mine owner, and the people who'd tried to bury him were now asking him for shovels. The conference room at Chen Textiles felt smaller than I remembered. Maybe it was because I was sitting at the head of the table instead along the side, or maybe it was because the people around me had shrunk somehow in the 6 months since I'd walked away from this family. Eleanor looked frail in her navy suit, her hands trembling slightly as she reached for her water glass. Richard had aged years in the past few weeks, his once commanding presence reduced to nervous glances and cleared throats. Victoria sat directly across from me, her expression carefully neutral, like we were strangers negotiating a business deal rather than former spouses dividing the wreckage of their shared life. The restructuring plan is non-negotiable, I said, sliding copies of the 40-page document across the polished wood surface. Every aspect of it, the facility consolidation, the staff reductions, the operational changes, the financial controls. If you want Martinez Capital to acquire Chen Textiles, these are the terms. Eleanor opened her copy with the kind of reluctance usually reserved for medical test results. Her eyes moved across the first page, and I watched her face change as she processed what she was reading. "You want us to sell the estate," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I want the company to divest non-essential assets and relocate operations to cost-effective facilities. The estate is a luxury the business can't afford. That house has been in our family for 30 years, and for 30 years it's been bleeding money that should have been invested in business growth. The annual maintenance costs alone could fund an entire marketing department." Richard cleared his throat, the sound echoing in the quiet room. "Marcus, surely we can find some middle ground. Perhaps we could keep the estate and make cuts elsewhere." I leaned back in the leather chair that had once belonged to him, meeting his gaze with the kind of steady confidence that came from holding all the cards in a negotiation. "Richard, let me explain something. This isn't a family discussion anymore. This is a business acquisition. Martinez Capital is offering to purchase Chen Textiles for $37 million, which is approximately $15 million more than any other buyer would pay for a company with your debt structure. In exchange for that premium, we're acquiring the right to make whatever operational changes are necessary to return the company to profitability." $37 million, Eleanor repeated, her voice hollow. "We built this company from nothing. It was worth 10 times that amount when my father-in-law founded it. Your father-in-law founded it 70 years ago, when market conditions were completely different. Since then, the company has lost value consistently, year after year, because management refused to adapt to changing circumstances. $37 million is what it's worth today,
not what it was worth in 1954. Victoria finally spoke, her voice carefully modulated to sound professional rather than personal. The severance packages you're proposing are generous, more generous than they need to be. She was right. The restructuring plan included substantial severance payments for employees who would be terminated, along with transition assistance and job placement services. It wasn't required by law, and it wasn't standard industry practice for a company in Chen Textile's financial condition. The severance packages reflect my values, not market requirements, I said. The people who work for this company aren't responsible for its management failures. They shouldn't be punished for decisions they had no voice in making. What I didn't say was that the generous severance packages were also strategic. Word traveled fast in the textile industry, and I wanted other companies to see Martinez Capital as a responsible acquirer who treated employees fairly during transitions. That reputation would be valuable when I pursued future acquisitions, making other business owners more willing to consider my offers. Eleanor was still reading through the restructuring plan, her finger tracing each line like she was trying to find escape clauses that didn't exist. "You're essentially dismantling everything we've built," she said, without looking up from the pages. "I'm dismantling everything that doesn't work and preserving everything that has value. The client relationships, the import licenses, the distribution agreements, the brand. Those assets are valuable, and they'll be protected. The executive offices, the country club memberships, the company cars, the expense accounts, those liabilities will be eliminated." Richard shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "What about management positions? What about our roles in the restructured company?" This was the question I'd been expecting, the moment when the conversation would shift from business terms to personal consequences. I'd spent considerable time thinking about how to handle it, and I'd decided that honesty would serve everyone's interests better than diplomatic evasion. "There won't be management positions for family members," I said. "The restructured company will be run by professional managers with industry expertise and proven track records. Family members who want to remain involved can apply for operational positions, but they'll be evaluated on the same criteria as any other candidates." The silence that followed was thick enough to cut with a knife. Eleanor set down the restructuring plan and stared at me with an expression I'd never seen before. Not anger, not disappointment, but something closer to recognition, like she was finally seeing me clearly for the first time.
"You're firing us," she said. "You're buying our company and firing us from our own business. I'm acquiring a failing business and implementing the management changes necessary to make it profitable. The fact that the current management consists of family members doesn't change the requirements for success." Victoria leaned forward, her hands clasped on the table in front of her. "Marcus, I understand that you're angry about what happened between us. I understand that you feel betrayed by how my family treated you, but this seems like punishment rather than business. I'd been expecting this accusation too, and I'd prepared for it by examining my own motivations as honestly as possible. Was I punishing the Chen family for their treatment of me? Was this acquisition motivated by revenge rather than opportunity?" The answer was complicated but ultimately clear. "Victoria, if I wanted to punish your family, I'd let Chen Textiles collapse into bankruptcy and then purchase the assets at liquidation prices. That would cost me about $12 million instead of $37 million, and it would leave all of you with nothing instead of substantial proceeds from the sale. The fact that I'm offering above market value for a failing business suggests that my motivations are more complex than revenge. Then why are you doing this?" I stood up and walked to the window overlooking the courtyard where I'd once imagined building something beautiful with people I'd thought would value my contributions. The view was the same, but my perspective had changed completely. "Because I see potential that you've never recognized. Because I know how to unlock value that you've been wasting for decades. Because acquiring Chen Textiles makes strategic sense for Martinez Capital regardless of our personal history." I turned back to face the table, meeting each of their gazes in turn. "The restructured company will generate approximately $8 million in annual profit within 2 years. That's more than Chen Textiles has earned in the past 8 years combined. The acquisition will pay for itself in less than 5 years, and after that it will provide substantial returns on investment while creating stable employment for the workers who remain." Richard was studying the financial projections in his copy of the restructuring plan, his forehead creased with concentration. "These numbers seem optimistic. How can you be confident in projections this aggressive?" "Because I've already implemented similar strategies in other companies. The operational efficiencies we're planning have proven successful across multiple industries and market conditions. The cost reductions we're targeting are based on detailed analysis of your current expense structure. The revenue growth we're projecting reflects market demand for products that you're already capable of producing if you eliminate the operational barriers that have been constraining your output. I returned to my seat and opened my own copy of the restructuring plan, turning to the section that outlined the integration strategy between Chen Textiles and my other business operations. The real value in this acquisition isn't just fixing Chen Textiles, it's creating synergies between your existing assets and the international network I've developed through Martinez Global Enterprises. Your client relationships will give my suppliers access to new markets. My supplier relationships will give your clients access to new products. The combined operation will be more valuable than either business operating independently. Eleanor was listening now with the kind of attention that suggested she was finally understanding the scope of what I'd built since leaving their family. Not just a successful import business but a comprehensive international network that could transform struggling companies into profitable enterprises. You're not just buying our company, she said slowly. You're absorbing it into something much larger. I'm integrating valuable assets into a diversified business empire that can support growth and weather economic uncertainty. Chen Textiles will become one division of Martinez Capital, alongside the other companies we've acquired and restructured over the past year. Victoria looked surprised. Other companies? How many acquisitions have you made? I smiled, not with malice but with the satisfaction that came from watching someone realize they'd underestimated the person they'd tried to diminish. Martinez Capital has acquired controlling interests in 6 companies since our divorce was finalized. Import operations in Los Angeles and Miami, a manufacturing facility in North Carolina, a logistics company in Chicago, a retail chain in the Southeast, and a technology firm in Austin that develops supply chain management software. Chen Textiles would be the 7th acquisition, and probably the most strategically valuable because of its established client relationships and distribution networks. The room was quiet as they processed this information. 6 months ago they'd seen me as Victoria's husband who'd gotten lucky with a small import business. Now they were learning that I'd built a business empire worth more than everything the Chen family had accumulated over 3 generations. How much is Martinez Capital worth? Richard asked, his voice barely audible. I considered whether to answer that question directly. The financial details of my business operations weren't relevant to the Chen Textiles acquisition, and I'd learned to be cautious about sharing information that could be used against me in future negotiations. But these people had called me a gold digger. They'd tried to steal the business I'd built. They'd treated me like hired help who'd gotten too comfortable with the family checkbook. They deserved to understand exactly how wrong they'd been about who was digging for gold and who was creating it. The current portfolio value is approximately $240 million. The projected value after completing planned acquisitions and restructuring efforts is approximately $400 million. Chen Textiles represents about 9% of our current operations and maybe 6% of our projected operations. Eleanor's water glass slipped from her hand and shattered on the floor, sending crystal fragments across the carpet. She stared at the broken pieces like they represented something more significant than just an accident. $240 million, she repeated. You built a $240 million business empire in 6 months. I built the foundation for a $240 million business empire over 3 years while you were calling me a parasite. The past 6 months were just about removing the obstacles that were preventing me from realizing its full potential. Victoria was shaking her head slowly like she was trying to process information that didn't fit with her understanding of reality. I don't understand how this is possible. When we were married you were working with one import business. You were focused on artisan partnerships and craft cooperatives. How did that become a $200 million empire? The same way Chen Textiles could have become a profitable operation if it had been managed properly. By identifying opportunities, implementing efficient systems and scaling successful strategies across multiple markets and business lines. I stood up again, this time to signal that the meeting was approaching its conclusion. The offer to acquire Chen Textiles is valid for 48 hours. If you accept, we can begin the integration process immediately and start implementing the operational changes that will return the company to profitability. If you decline, Chen Textiles will continue on its current trajectory toward bankruptcy, and the assets will eventually be acquired by other buyers at liquidation prices. Richard was gathering the pages of the restructuring plan into a neat stack, his movements careful and deliberate. We'll need to discuss this as a family, he said. Of course. But understand that the terms aren't negotiable. Martinez Capital has completed enough acquisitions to know what works and what doesn't. The restructuring plan represents best practices developed through experience with similar companies in similar situations. Eleanor was still staring at the broken glass on the floor, but she looked up when I mentioned the non-negotiable terms. What if we wanted to retain some management involvement? What if we were willing to accept reduced roles but still maintain some connection to the company? It was a reasonable question, and I'd actually considered whether there might be positions within the restructured company where family members could contribute value without compromising operational efficiency. Eleanor, you have extensive knowledge of the textile industry and established relationships with suppliers and clients that could be valuable to the restructured operation. If you're interested in a consulting role with clearly defined responsibilities and performance expectations, that could be discussed as part of the integration planning. And Richard, I looked at Victoria's father, trying to assess whether he had skills that could benefit the company beyond his historical connection to it. The honest answer was that his management style had been largely responsible for Chen Textile's decline, but he did have relationships and institutional knowledge that might be worth preserving in some capacity. Richard would need to demonstrate that he could adapt to new operational requirements and accept supervision from professional managers. If he's willing to do that, there might be a role in business development or client relations. Victoria hadn't asked about herself, but I could see the question in her eyes. Victoria, your legal background could be valuable in contract negotiation and regulatory compliance. If you're interested in contributing to the company's success rather than maintaining a family legacy, there could be opportunities. She nodded slowly, and for the first time since I'd entered the conference room, I saw something in her expression that reminded me of the woman I'd fallen in love with years ago. Not the entitled daughter of a wealthy family, but the intelligent, capable person who'd understood that success required work rather than inheritance. I gathered my own papers and prepared to leave the conference room for what would probably be the last time as an outsider trying to convince the Chen family to see reason. 48 hours, I said. After that, the offer expires and Martinez Capital will pursue other acquisition opportunities. As I reached the door, Eleanor's voice stopped me. Marcus, I turned back to face her. I owe you an apology. We all do. We treated you badly, and we were wrong about your character and your capabilities. You deserved better from this family. The apology was genuine, and I could see that it cost her something to deliver it. Eleanor Chen had probably never apologized to anyone she'd considered beneath her station, and doing so now represented a fundamental shift in how she saw me and our relationship. Thank you, I said. I appreciate that. Do you think you'll ever be able to forgive us? I considered the question carefully, trying to separate my personal feelings from the business relationship we were negotiating. Eleanor, forgiveness isn't really the right concept for what happened between us. You treated me according to your understanding of who I was and what I represented. I responded according to my understanding of how I wanted to be treated. Neither of us was entirely wrong, but we had different perspectives on what family relationships should look like. And now we have the opportunity to build a professional relationship based on mutual respect and shared objectives. That's probably healthier than trying to recreate a family relationship that didn't work the first time. I left the Chen Textiles building and walked to my car, a new Porsche that represented everything I'd learned about the difference between earning wealth and inheriting it. The Chen family had inherited their status and spent decades trying to maintain it through appearances rather than performance. I'd built my wealth through strategy and execution, and I'd learned to measure success by results rather than perception. My phone buzzed with a message from Sarah Goldman. Meridian Capital called. Harrison wants to discuss 3 new acquisition opportunities that came available this morning. Can you meet tomorrow at 10? I smiled as I started the car. The Chen Textiles acquisition would be resolved within 48 hours one way or another. But regardless of their decision, Martinez Capital would continue growing, acquiring companies, and building value through operational excellence rather than family politics. 2 days later, I received a call from Victoria while I was reviewing proposals for acquiring a textile machinery manufacturer in Georgia. We accept your offer, she said without preamble. All of us. The restructuring plan, the management changes, the operational requirements, everything. I'm pleased to hear that. There's one more thing. My mother asked me to tell you that she's grateful you're giving us the opportunity to remain involved with the company. She said she understands now that you were never trying to take anything from us. You were trying to build something with us, and we were too blind to see it. I set down the acquisition proposal and walked to the window of my new office, which overlooked the harbor and provided a view of the city where I'd once been dismissed as a gold digger. Victoria, I hope the restructured company will be something we can all be proud of. Not as family but as business partners working toward shared objectives. I hope so too. After ending the call, I returned to the Georgia textile machinery proposal. The acquisition would complement the Chen Textiles operation perfectly, providing manufacturing capabilities that could support vertical integration and improve profit margins across multiple product lines. The gold digger had indeed found gold, but it turned out the gold was inside himself all along, waiting for the right conditions to shine. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.